Greetings all, Ferrariman601 here. Welcome to video number 3 in the Sim Racing 101 series, designed just to show you the fundamentals of sim racing when it comes to things like car control, vehicle dynamics, and a little bit of basic setup. Today we are at the Nürburgring Grand Prix circuit, and to help us out in our quest we have the BMW M4 modified by Akrapovic with their exhaust system, which makes the car sound very nasty indeed. Oh yes, definitely loving that. I've picked this car for a couple of reasons. One, it's rear-wheel drive, so that means the engine is sending all of its torque to the rear axle and to the rear axle only. Number two, it's front-engined, so we have decent weight distribution between the weight of the engine in the front and the weight of the driveline components and the fuel tank in the back. Number three, it's got 425 horsepower, so it's a small car, it's a light car, and it's a powerful car. And it's also a BMW, meaning that it is a very, very nicely balanced machine straight off the showroom floor. It's designed with driving enthusiasts in mind, so it has a fairly neutral handling characteristic overall. Today what I'd like to talk about is sort of a development on the last video about understeer and oversteer, but I'd like to talk about how do you compensate for situations like this while you're out on track. In the last video we talked about what understeer is and what oversteer is, but we didn't really go into talking about how do you deal with these things while you're out on track. In a perfect world, you'd be able to do an out lap, a hot lap, an in lap, and then play with your setup until everything felt perfect. However, many times this is not the case. If you're in a race situation and you encounter understeer or you encounter oversteer, you're not going to be able to go back to the pits and change your setup because you're basically going to be forfeiting your position in the race at that point. So that means we have to compensate in other ways, mainly from the cockpit and things that we can do to adjust our driving style and the way that we use the different tools available to us in the cockpit to adjust for these little disturbances in the force. So, just to demonstrate this to you, we're going to go out on track and we're going to discuss the steering and pedal inputs that we're going to be using here to compensate for different conditions that we'll find corner to corner. This first lap we're going to be at a relaxed pace just to show you the circuit and to get you acquainted with how the car behaves in pretty normal running conditions. You'll see running at a relaxed pace like this, all of my inputs are very gradual and very deliberate. The car is happy right now. Everything is neutral. We're well within the limits of the tires and the chassis, so my goal right now is just to keep the car running online where I want it to go. There are no surprises right now. Everything is nicely balanced. Everything is well within the performance envelope. At the moment, the car feels neutral, it feels very controllable, and it feels like it is responding as I'd expect to all of my control inputs. This is good. This is the mark of a very, very good beast indeed. Few companies are better than BMW when it comes to producing cars that are instantly drivable. You can see over 100 miles per hour there. Can take that right-hand corner flat on the throttle. I won't say flat out because we were definitely in a much higher gear than we will be later on, but the car does not care. It'll corner in triple-digit speeds in certain corners anyway, and it's very happy to do so. However, what happens when we run into some handling deficits? Without changing the car's setup, what we're going to do is basically overdrive the car, or underdrive the car, depending on your perspective, and induce understeer and oversteer conditions. What I aim to do here is to show you how you can compensate for these different running conditions while you're out on track without necessitating a pit stop or setup changes. So into turn 1 here, it is very tight. We're traveling at the correct speed. We entered on the appropriate line, and turn 1 is quite academic. Turn 2, we have understeer. As a refresher, understeer is when there is a deficit in front end grip. This means that the front tires are overwhelmed in their capacity to grip the racetrack and generate traction that you can then use to accelerate, to brake, or to turn. In the case of this car, your braking and your turning is what the front wheels are doing because it's rear-wheel drive, like I mentioned. No power goes to the front wheels. But when we encounter understeer, how do we compensate for it? I'd like to draw your attention to the box in the lower left of your screen. Those are my pedal inputs. The green bar that you see right now is the trace of my accelerator, and the red bar that's coming up right now is my brake. The blue bar to the extreme left of that box is the clutch. In this car, the clutch is hydraulically controlled, completely automatic, so I do not have any clutch control at this moment. When we run into an understeer situation, like I said, the front tires are overwhelmed in their capacity to generate traction. Most of the time, this occurs because we're traveling too fast in order to make the car do what we want it to do at that time. So the easy way to compensate for understeer is to slow down. The object of racing is to go fast. Yes. However, fast has limits. If we go too fast into a corner, we're going to overwhelm the tires, the car's not going to make it around the corner, and we're going to go off at best and crash at worst. Oftentimes, a slower approach into a corner, making sure that the tires are well within their limits of performance, is going to yield a faster lap time on aggregate than somebody who brakes late, turns in too hard, like this, and generates an armful of understeer. So in compensating for understeer, we need to make sure that once we're in an understeer situation, we reduce our speed. I'll demonstrate that now, probably through turn 2, because turn 1 is a little too tight. Okay, so into turn 2, we're going to approach a bit too fast. The car's drifting wide, off of the throttle, letting the front tires catch up to what the car's doing, then back on the power. Same thing through here, some understeer, letting the car slow down, the front grips, back on the power. Understeer off the throttle, let the front end catch up, on the power. Understeer is pretty easy to contend with. It can be frustrating because it causes you to slow down, and if you're going for lap time or if you're in a battle for position in a race, slowing down is the last thing you're thinking about. However, to get you out of trouble, that's exactly what you need to do. Oversteer, as we talked about in the previous video, is the opposite of understeer, where the rear end does not have enough grip. In this car, to induce an oversteer situation, I'm going to have to put way too much throttle into the engine while I'm mid-corner. This is going to cause the back end to step out and create an oversteer condition. I can also generate oversteer by being too aggressive on my turn-in, thus upsetting the balance of the car front to rear and left to right, causing the rear tires to slide. Make sure our traction control is off, and it is. Oversteer. That's an oversteer situation. And this is an understeer situation. And an oversteer situation. You can see how one can certainly beget the other. When it comes to dealing with oversteer, we have a fundamentally different aim than we do when we're dealing with understeer. Oversteer is unstable, unlike understeer, which is quite stable for the most part. Oversteer turns the car into an inverted pendulum, like we talked about in the previous video. It causes the rear to want to overtake the front and spin the car into a direction opposite the direction of travel. So to correct for that, we need to change that balance in this overall system of energy, both kinetic and potential. You'll see what I'm doing with the throttle there. I'm coming off of the throttle when I recognize an oversteer situation develop. I am then turning into the direction of the slide. So in other words, I'm turning in the direction I want the car to travel and modulating my pedal inputs accordingly until I recognize the back end is starting to arrest its slide, returning me with all four wheels in unison in the direction I want to go. Unlike understeer, oversteer does not require you to slow down per se. Oversteer requires you to change the direction of that kinetic energy that is in this system right now, so that it starts to work for you rather than against you. This is the entire rationale of drifting. Just like an inverted pendulum, the rocket problem again, we have a balance point in this system. When we reach that balance point, all other extraneous rotation will stop. And when that happens, the car will enter a four-wheel drift, meaning that it will continue to go sideways relative to the direction of travel, but it will do it in a uniform fashion with all four wheels traveling in the same direction relative to each other. This balance point is what drifters go after. And in terms of correcting oversteer, it's the point we go after as well. Although unlike drifters, we aim not to stay there for too long, we aim to continue progressing back to a straight and level path. In the situations we're seeing right now, our oversteer is mostly caused by wheel spin. Those rear tires have broken their traction, and they are no longer using the forces that they generate to propel the car forward. Instead, the rear axle is simply spinning up, and the rear tires are getting hot and wearing out. All of that energy is being wasted because we don't have sufficient traction on the rear axle. To get that traction back, we bleed off the throttle, we allow the rotational speed of the rear axle to slow, at which point the tires will begin to grip again on the rear, and control is restored. See lots of oversteer being induced here. So with a combination of pedal inputs, mostly with the throttle, and steering inputs, mostly with counter steering, or opposite lock as it's known, we can use that slide on the rear end to our advantage to keep the car traveling in the direction we'd like to go. And then as we continue to build momentum in our intended path, we can convert some of that kinetic energy back into repositioning the rear axle behind the front axle and propelling us forward once again. Because oversteer is unstable, and when a car is not set up correctly, or you have tires that are beginning to wear out, it can catch you by surprise. It takes a lot of practice to get comfortable with oversteer and to become proficient in rectifying an oversteer situation. And in a lot of cars, particularly high downforce formula cars, in a severe oversteer condition like this, you will almost always spin, because the slip angles on the tires in cars like that are so fine that once you go beyond them, the tires have no capacity to generate grip, and eventually you just end up on ice, effectively. With street tires like we have here, they have a much wider performance envelope at which they can be efficient in generating traction, so that's why it's easier to correct slides in a car like this than it is on a race car in many cases. Back to understeer. We're going too fast, and then I overcompensated for the understeer. I slowed down too much, the front end gripped, I felt confident, I got on the power, and then I overwhelmed the rear axle. So you can see how understeer and oversteer sometimes go hand in hand. If you have a car that's not well balanced, this will often be the case, and you will have absolutely no lap time whatsoever. However, if we control our inputs, if we're very measured with how we do everything, with our steering, with our brake, with our throttle, you will see that it's very easy to keep the car online, going in the direction we intend. See, I caught some oversteer mid-corner there. I backed out of the throttle. I threw in a little opposite lock, not really returning the steering much farther than center, because the slide was not that far advanced at that point, but back out of the throttle, steer into the direction of the slide. In other words, in the direction you intend to go, and use your eyes to tell you when the horizon stops shifting beyond the point you want it to. There really is no better remedy for not being able to control oversteer or understeer for that matter than practice. You must practice a lot. You must put yourself in situations where your abilities are going to be challenged. You must become very proficient at reading vehicle dynamics corner to corner. Like right now, I know my tires are hot and they're worn out because we've been sliding around so much. So I'm driving to those conditions. I understand that the tires don't have the grip that they once had when they were new. I also understand that the high tire temperatures, particularly on the rear, make them even more liable to slide, or in the case of the rear axle, spin, sliding in a straight line. Once you become aware of how those dynamics operate and you become aware of the individual characteristics of the cars that you're going to be driving, it becomes easier to adjust for these sorts of situations when they occur. So here we are back in the pit lane. That's car control in terms of the inputs that you use, the accelerator, the brake, and the steering. Hopefully this was insightful. Thank you very much.